Good afternoon. My name is Doug Erber, and I am honored to have the full-time position as president of the Japan-America Society of Southern California. And on behalf of all of our sponsors today, I welcome you. This is the 105th anniversary of the Japan-America Society. And instead of me telling you what we do, we have a video to introduce the Japan-America Society that if I could ask you to make your attention to the screens.
Since its founding in 1909, the Japan-America Society has embraced its mission to build economic, cultural, governmental, personal relationships between the people of Japan and America. We accomplish this by offering networking opportunities with distinguished Japanese and American business and community leaders, as well as informative programs that address topics of interest for business executives. Through the Hitachi Japanese Kite workshops, the Society provides exceptional educational and cultural programs that benefit underserved children.
What do these three kanji mean?
In 2013, the Society kicked off the inaugural Japan Bowl of Southern California. Students competed in Japan-related language and cultural topics. Questions were given verbally, both in English and Japanese. Top 3 teams from each level advanced to the championships to win a trip to compete in the National Japan Bowl held in Washington, D.C. The students enjoyed and learned from the game show-style competition. JAS encourages the next generation to continue being involved in U.S.-Japan relations. In addition to educational programs, the events and programs are designed to promote friendship and better understanding between Japanese and Americans. In December 2012, the Society brought the best of Japan to Los Angeles.
Introduce to you, Iron Chef French, Hiroyuki Sakai. The executive chef here at Intercontinental Los Angeles Century City at Beverly Hills, Jonathan Wood.
"230 guests enjoyed a gourmet 6-course dinner prepared by the Iron Chef Hiroyuki Sakai and Intercontinental Los Angeles Century City at Beverly Hills Executive Chef Jonathan Wood.
We're going to go live right now.
With live feed from the kitchen stadium, guests interacted with the 2 chefs. The event helped raise over $100,000 for youth programs offered by the Japan-America Society of Southern California.
I'm sorry Iron Chef's not here today, but he has indicated that he definitely wants to come back, and it's in this ballroom where that took place, thanks to the Intercontinental LA Century City at Beverly Hills and also Nito Tires. Today's symposium is made possible by a generous grant from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, which was established in Japan in 1986. Its mission is to promote world peace by continuing contributing to the welfare of humankind and the sound development of international community. The grant was offered to the 37 Japan-America societies in the United States, thanks to the vision and facilitation of the National Association of Japan-America Societies. Executives from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation couldn't make it today, but I'm pleased to introduce the president of the National Association of Japan-America Societies. Please welcome Peter Kelly. Peter's happy to be here because their office is in Washington, D.C. He told me last night he let his wife know where the snow shovels were. Our partner in presenting Japan in 2014 Symposium is the Japan Business Association of Southern California. JBA, as it's commonly known, is also a sponsor for today's symposium, and they organized the second panel featuring some of the most prominent Japanese business executives in the United States. JBA will be recognized later in the program. I wish to thank our other partners and cooperating organizations, the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles, KPMG, the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, Town Hall Los Angeles, our good friends at the U.S.-Japan Council, and the World Affairs Council of Orange County. Finally, we have two additional sponsors. The first is this renowned landmark, the Intercontinental LA Century City Hotel. When you enter this hotel, you experience hospitality and service that is second to none. The Intercontinental is where the Japan American Society and other prominent organizations host our most important meetings and events. I'm pleased to recognize the owner of the hotel, who serves on the Society's Board of Directors. Please welcome the President of Sumitomo Realty and Development, USA, Ms. Madi Miyoshi. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the representative of our other sponsor, United Airlines, which is generously serving as the official airline of the Japan in 2014 Symposium. Please welcome United Airlines Los Angeles and Regional Director, Mr. Robert French.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug. So United Airlines is pleased to partner with the Japan American Society on this symposium and to be the official airline of this event. We've had a long-running relationship with the Japan American Society, one that we intend to continue. So thanks to the Society, thanks to Doug for your work, Ambassador Roos, Ambassador Fujikawa, and panelists and guests. You know, United flies daily from LA to Narita on the new Boeing Dreamliner 787, which is turning out to be a sophisticated and passenger-friendly airline. And from Narita, we connect to over 18 different Asia destinations, including trade and business centers like Bangkok, Seoul, and Singapore. In addition to that, we are very fortunate to have a great joint venture partner, ANA. When I was talking to Ambassador Roos before the lunch, he just flew from San Jose to Narita on our joint venture partner. And that synergy is one that we're exploring and helps make us a better combination and also a better contracting partner for many of the corporations in this room. You know, the Pacific region is extremely important to United Airlines, more so every day. And we are building the best trans-Pacific network of any carrier that has the most nonstop flights to Asia, more than any other U.S. airline. So I think that blends well into what's going on here. So on behalf of my United sales colleagues to my left, Tom Akamatsu and Ray Lucero, we thank you for allowing us to be the official sponsor, and a sponsorship that we would like to continue. So thanks very much. And one footnote on this video that is coming up next, I think, right, Doug? This video was shot in the summer at LAX in a hangar on a 777. We removed the roof panels off the airplane so the production crew could do the filming, and we put artificial ice down the aisles of the airplane so that this video could be made. Check it out.
United, carrying the hopes of a nation for over 30 years. That's Team USA friendly.
Thank you again. And please go ahead and begin to enjoy your meal, and we'll be back in a little bit for our keynote speaker. Once again, everybody, I apologize for interrupting your relationship building and conversations, but we're going to, in the interest of time, go ahead and get started. On your tables are note cards. The note cards are for questions. There's also pens on your table. As I'm moderating our keynote speaker's Q&A, please have some really good questions on TPP, and our staff will come by and pick them up and deliver them to me. So, again, the cards on your table, at the top of each table, and the pens are for questions. During the panel portion, if you have a question for a specific panelist, please be sure to write that, and we'll go ahead and get started. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our symposium keynote speaker. We originally had Wendy Cutler, Acting Deputy Director for the U.S. Trade Representative, as our speaker. However, as lead negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, we knew there was a chance she may be called away on official duty. And that is exactly what happened. Late last week, she got word to resume TPP talks in Tokyo, and that's where she is. However, before departing, Ms. Cutler kindly arranged for her friend and TPP colleague, James Fothery, to pinch hit for her. We could not have asked for a better expert to step up and take the place of Ms. Cutler. Please welcome our keynote speaker, President of the U.S.-Japan Business Council and Senior Director for Japan and Korea at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C., Mr. James Fothery.
Good afternoon. Please don't let me get in the way of your eating lunch. I'm going to pull out my old man glasses here so I can see my remarks. Douglas, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am very delighted to be here at the Japan-American Society, Southern California. I'm based in Washington, D.C., so I'm really glad to be here. I also have to say about my friend Wendy Cutler, this is yet another example of how persuasive she is. I actually owed her something, and so I'm here. No way out of it. I also want to acknowledge the great support of United Airlines for this event, but also United is a great partner of the U.S.-Japan Business Council and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and so I appreciate very much their diligence in helping all the speakers, including myself, get here. Wendy sends her regrets, but as Douglas said, she's in the middle of negotiations that are at a fairly intense point. Couldn't really get away, so I'm here in her stead. I will try to offer some remarks that I think are in line with what she would say. I'm at liberty to be a little more colorful, if you will, than a senior U.S. trade negotiator, so I hope I can help your understanding of this thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Negotiation, or TPP. Before I get into the remarks, let me ask, how many of you are familiar with the TPP? Okay, so there's a fair amount. If I were in Tokyo and I asked this question, how many people know about the TPP? All the hands would go up. TPP is on the news all the time, for good reasons and for bad ones. I would say that outside of some fairly narrow circles in the U.S., not many people know about TPP. And I think the main reason for that is that it's a big, complicated trade agreement, and people generally don't have a good awareness of how important trade is to the U.S. economy. People in L.A. do, because your region is so dependent on trade, your ports, your tech companies, et cetera. But by and large, people aren't aware of this thing called the TPP. The ones that are aware of it are misconstruing it. They're putting out misinformation about the TPP. To them, TPP is going to be the arrival of the black helicopters and the surrender of U.S. sovereignty to the United Nations and global law and the takeover of the U.S. economy by faceless corporations, all of which sounds like a good script for Fox Studios right down the street here. But it's not true. This is not happening in the TPP, but it's much less entertaining. But before I get into this, let me just highlight why trade and trade agreements are so important. We in Washington talk about trade agreements all the time because they help U.S. companies do business overseas. So here are a few factoids. 95% of the world's population and 80% of global GDP is outside of the United States, so it's a global market. The 20 current U.S. free trade agreement partners represent 10% of global GDP, but they buy half of U.S. exports. Our U.S. FTA partners purchase 12.8 times on average more than our non-FTA partners. Our exports to FTA partners grow more rapidly than they do to non-export partners. 97% of exporters are small and medium-sized enterprises. So for those companies, lowering tariffs, getting rid of red tape at the border through customs and other things actually helps them more than it does for these faceless global corporations because they just have a much lower margin of operation. And then finally, the bottom line is trade means jobs. 38 million jobs in the U.S. depend on trade, and that includes 1 in 3 manufacturing jobs. So to set the stage, trade is important, trade agreements are important. So what is this TPP and why is this so important? There are 12 economies in TPP. I'll go through them. Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, the United States. Those occupy very high levels of economic development in the form of the United States and Japan, and relatively low levels, Vietnam. What's significant about this is that they have all voluntarily come into this agreement because they realize even though it requires some tough things for them to do domestically, it's in their long-term economic interest to make changes to open their economy, increase trade. So they're voluntarily doing this.
Good questions.
For the United States, TPP is important because it is, I think, the most concrete example yet of the Obama administration's so-called rebalance to Asia. Gets us in the region. In economic terms, it's important because it places the U.S. at the center of the most dynamic region in the world economy. And there are other regional trade agreements that are being negotiated simultaneously, which do not include the United States, but include China. So it's important for the United States to be successful in the TPP negotiations. And then in trade policy terms, which is what we talk about in Washington, TPP is the most ambitious, highest standard, most comprehensive agreement yet undertaken. It would do or attempt to do 2 things. Eliminate traditional barriers to trade, tariffs that are simple to identify, not so simple to negotiate away, but those raise the prices of goods exported from the United States. In principle, this is going to cover all goods, agricultural and industrial across the board, no exceptions. The political reality is that every country has highly sensitive products. For the U.S., it's things like sugar, dairy, textiles, and autos. For Japan, it's agriculture, agriculture, agriculture. So those are some of the things that are blocking up the TPP negotiation. TPP goes way beyond these sensitivities and barriers, though, that are traditional in nature. And they call TPP the first 21st century trade agreement. And by that, it specifically aims to eliminate what are called non-tariff barriers, regulatory issues, product safety standards, customs rules, et cetera, that are behind the border, if you will. So you can get your product into the market without a tariff, but then you encounter all these things behind the border that affect your ability to sell it, find distributors, and do the things that you can do to sell it and make money. So some of the major areas that are being addressed in the TPP are new areas like intellectual property, regulatory coherence and transparency, investment, government procurement, competition with state-owned enterprises, cross-border data movement, which is important in the 21st century economy because you got to be able to move data from one point to the next without restriction on where you can locate your servers and process the information and all that sort of stuff. Supply chain things that would eliminate chokeholds in the supply chain to make things more efficient. Some provisions that would address problems specifically encountered by small and medium-sized enterprises, but also really to help educate them about the benefits and the advantages of TPP and help them benefit from it. And then lastly, labor and environment, which, you know, you've got Vietnam, which has got low labor standards. You've got the U.S. and Japan, which have high labor standards. Opponents of trade, you know, hate that kind of thing where you've got two very diverse stages of economic development because they think it's the race to the bottom in terms of labor. So TPP is very focused on trying to get the highest possible labor standards so that it doesn't turn out to be so. As we get further into the TPP, how these market access sensitivities and how these 21st century issues are handled, and indeed the trade-offs that are going to be required to get the deal done, are going to be the key to the success here. Now, what's Japan's role in TPP? Japan entered the TPP formally in July after committing to do so in the spring. We at the U.S.-Japan Business Council, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, have said that Japan's entry into TPP is a game changer for the TPP, and here's why. First, with Japan in it, TPP is much more significant in commercial terms. Japan's GDP exceeds that of all non-U.S. TPP members combined. So it just raises the stakes. TPP would include 40% of global GDP and a third of global trade if we can successfully conclude it. So in short, it's a big deal. Secondly, it does provide what we think is a great opportunity for the U.S. and Japan to work together to shape the rules for trade in the 21st century. The U.S. and Japan are both affluent, technologically sophisticated, innovative economies. We have common interest, and we're aligned on things like intellectual property, investment, state-owned enterprises, the data rules, et cetera. We think that we can work with them as an ally to get these high standards into a trade agreement, which would then set a model or a benchmark for subsequent global trade agreements. That's a high order, but I think it's something that's very important because there are many other trade negotiations going on at the same time. Third, and maybe most importantly, it's a historic opportunity to really improve the U.S.-Japan bilateral economic relationship. We've got a big trading relationship already with Japan, over $200 billion two-way trade each year. We think under TPP this can grow substantially, not only in the U.S. favor, but some in the mutually beneficial ways, but primarily by eliminating non-tariff measures in Japan that have traditionally formed barriers for companies trying to export there. And structurally, it's important because we've got the 12-nation agreement, but we also have a separate parallel bilateral negotiation. That sounds very Washington, and I know it's very boring. I see eyes glazing over. I apologize. But essentially what it means is that there's the 12 countries negotiating, and there's the U.S. and Japan negotiating. Wendy Cutler is at the center of the U.S.-Japan negotiation, but she's also bringing it into the context of the overall negotiation. So she's a critical person in this whole exercise. And in the bilateral negotiation, she's focused on things like eliminating non-tariff measures in autos, insurance, government procurement, agriculture, et cetera. Not surprisingly, given the history of U.S.-Japan trade relations, the automotive issues are the most difficult for us, and in some ways for Japan, but agriculture is the other thing. So it's the two A's, autos and agriculture, that really lie at the key to getting through to the end game of TPP. Let me talk a minute about what TPP means for Japan, and this is what I call the Abe opportunity. I think you all are aware that Prime Minister Abe, since coming into office in December 2012, has really captivated world attention on Japan once again for the first time in a long time. He's got a very dynamic economic program called Abenomics, which has got three parts, or three arrows, as they call it, according to an old Japanese folk tale. First part is fiscal stimulus. The second part is really massive monetary easing, and the third part is structural reforms, or things that would eliminate regulations, standards, customs rules, and the like that make it difficult for companies, including Japanese companies, to operate efficiently. So he's focused on that. The world has taken notice. Japanese stock market has risen dramatically. Executives that I speak to are more optimistic about Japan than they have been in a long time. So in that sense, it's a very good story. The Prime Minister goes around to New York, to Davos, to places. He's become quite a jet setter, and he's talking about how Japan is back and that he wants to make Japan the most business-friendly economy in Asia, if not the world. And I think all that is great. It's all very encouraging. And there are just some things that they're going to have to work through. Particularly because there's only so much room for fiscal measures, only so much room for monetary easing. So he's really got to focus on this third arrow. Unfortunately, so far, what they've talked about under the third arrow is a bit underwhelming. They haven't really put out any measures that have captivated attention, with the exception of TPP. And here, his commitment to enter Japan into TPP was quite a bold move because he did it before the upper house election in July of 2013. Most politicians would not do that. Conventional wisdom was that Abe would not want to do that because he was trying to make sure that the LDP would sweep the upper house, and then they would have control of both the upper and the lower houses, et cetera. So he did, and he deserves credit for that. How's it going so far? You know, Japan has entered the negotiations formally in July. They, not surprisingly, committed a very large, very talented team of trade negotiators under the Prime Minister's office. I like to joke that Japan's team has 100 people, and USTR has 8 people and an intern. It's a really good intern, but I mean, come on. Big discrepancy there. But they've come in and they've learned the issues, they've studied their briefs, they've contributed very positively on what are called the rules areas, the intellectual property stuff, the investment things, the state-owned enterprises. And we find, to the extent that we can get information in the private sector, that the U.S. and Japan are pretty closely aligned in these areas. And so that's all good. It's not all going well, though, because we still have some room to go on the market access part, and that's the agricultural negotiations and resolving the auto issues. And on the market access issues, here's the crux of it. The Prime Minister committed to a comprehensive agreement. He did that knowing that some of his LDP party members didn't support it, and that they wanted protection of so-called 5 sacred areas, which are rice, wheat, beef and pork, dairy, and sugar. This has then led Japanese negotiators to say, okay, we've got these 5 sensitive areas, we need exemptions in these areas. The problem is that according to USTR, if you take all the tariffs in those 5 areas, it's 600 tariff lines, and that's a lot to exclude from a trade agreement. This is where it gets a little, I don't want to get too wonky here, but just let me explain in relative terms what this means. So, according to what we know from press accounts, Japanese officials are getting to a threshold of about 93 to 95% tariff coverage, which is actually good compared to what they've done in previous trade agreements, which have averaged 85% tariff coverage. That's a substantial improvement. But it's not yet at the TPP standard. And so this last little bit in the TPP negotiations is how much Japan can go above 95 towards the 100% goal that everyone has established. You've got some key agricultural exporters in the TPP: Australia, Canada, Chile, Mexico, New Zealand, and the United States, of course. And it's not just the United States, it's all of these countries that have expectations that Japan is going to do more to open its agricultural market. And they're all focused on that in this upcoming round. The problem for Japan in seeking so many exemptions, and it becomes a problem for everyone, is that if Japan seeks so many, then all the other countries will want exemptions too. Pretty soon you have a very watered down agreement, and then you don't get the overall benefits to trade of a comprehensive, bold agreement. As I said before, you not only get growing markets for your exports, but you get some competitive benefits from changing internally, particularly in an inefficient sector like agriculture, and you get lower prices for your consumers, et cetera. That's all trade theory stuff, but it all is very applicable in practice if you look at things historically. Ultimately, that all feeds into domestic economic growth, and that's why the Prime Minister wanted do this, and I think still is committed and wants to do this. But here we are in the end game, or crunch time, both in the overall negotiations and the bilateral. The next round is February 22 through 25 in Singapore. I think if the U.S. and Japan, as the largest, most sophisticated members of TPP, can come together and show leadership to push this through, then there will be significant headway made in the Singapore negotiations. If they can't do that, then this thing could drag out, and I think that's not in anyone's interest. U.S. Trade Representative Froman frequently says that TPP doesn't get better with age. I think that's generally true of this and other trade negotiations, but they've got to be able to come together, and I would suggest this. For the U.S. and Japan, it's particularly important to focus on the 21st century issues and not get hung up on the 19th century issues. We can't advance our economies. We can't continue to be innovative and competitive if we're going to just not allow our most competitive industries to benefit from a trade agreement because we're going to protect our least efficient. And that all sounds harsh, in political and social terms sometimes, but I think that's the reality. And you can build in ways to stage this over time. Take the case of Vietnam, the least developed member of TPP. 40% of Vietnam's economy is controlled by state-owned enterprises. They have said that they're willing to adopt rules for state-owned enterprises through TPP if they can get more access to the U.S. and the other wealthier TPP members for things like textiles, footwear, and catfish. And I can't begin to tell you how strenuously Southern congressmen object to importing catfish from Vietnam, or some people in the Northeast object to importing footwear or textiles from Vietnam, but it's quite strong. So they have to figure out ways to balance all that. None of this is an appealing prospect in Congress. So this gets me to one issue that's been much in the news lately, the so-called Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA. This is another Washington thing, and try not to let your heads hit the table as I get into this. The bill was put forth in January by Senators Baucus, Congressman Camp, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee from Michigan, and Senator Hatch from Utah. It would give the president the authority to negotiate a trade agreement in consultation with Congress, but would not give Congress the authority to amend the agreement once it's ultimately negotiated. This is important for our trade partners because it gives them confidence that what is negotiated by their negotiating teams will be what they then have to take to their legislatures or their assemblies. It's a very important thing. I think Wendy Cutler would say that they're working very, very hard on Capitol Hill. She and Ambassador Froman and others are working closely with Congress to move this forward. One thing that's changed a bit is that Senator Baucus is now going to become the ambassador to China. He's been one of the most stalwart members of Congress in support of trade. Now the Finance Committee is going to be chaired by Senator Wyden from Oregon. What's interesting about that is that Oregon is a very trade-dependent state, particularly with the Pacific in mind. And he's voted for all major trade bills over the last decade, including TPA in 2002. Some people may ask this during the Q&A, but I'll beat you to the punch. Senator Reid, the day after the State of the Union address came out, and said, I wouldn't suggest bringing the TPA up right now, and emphasize right now. Harry Reid has never voted for trade bills. He doesn't support it, but he allows the votes to go through. So there is a path for this to get done, and they're working very aggressively on it. This all then feeds into the TPP process because as TPP moves forward, it will ramp up the pressure on Congress to get a TPA bill done so that they can close this thing out. But ultimately, I would leave with this. I think really the critical piece is whether Japan can come to Singapore with a much stronger offer on agricultural market access opening. If they can do that, then I think not only the United States, but Australia, Canada, and the others will be able to break through some of the issues that they have. Japan can't do that alone. The U.S. has got to signal its willingness to be flexible on things like sugar and textiles and the others. And so I think, again, it's the U.S. and Japan together as the largest economies and as strong strategic partners that can lead this thing to a successful conclusion. And I think it's clearly in our interest that we get this done sooner rather than later, and hopefully they'll make big headway in Singapore. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very. Am I on? Okay, there I am. Thank you very much, James. We have more than 20 questions and 15 minutes to do it. So I'm going to combine some of these. The first is, American farm groups indicate they might not support TPP if Japan continues to resist farm liberalization. Is this a serious threat or just a negotiating tactic?
Both.
Okay. We might get through these. Some people say the U.S. is always on the offensive, not defensive, in free trade agreement negotiations. Is this the case with TPP, and should the U.S. change some policies based on TPP negotiations?
That's a good question, and I think I'll take a little more time on that one. I think clearly the U.S. has got offensive interest, if you will, in things like strong rules for intellectual property protection. We've got a very strong domestic pharmaceutical industry, our IT industries, our content industries, entertainment, in L.A. Those all need strong IP protection in order to succeed overseas. That's why we're pushing hard on those things, because those are high-value industries, and that will create high-wage jobs in America, and it's a very important thing economically and politically. We are defensive on the 19th century things, the textiles, the footwear, the sugar. Sugar, we always used to think that sugar was just a handful of guys who were from Cuba who lived in Florida, but actually sugar covers a broad swath of the United States because of sugar beets. Montana, Minnesota, a whole bunch of countries actually are concerned about sugar liberalization. So it's a bit trickier than we used to think. But it's really ultimately trying to work with other countries to persuade them why it's important to protect innovation through things like IP, why it's important to establish clear rules that level the playing field for competition with state-owned enterprises. Part of the backdrop of the TPP negotiations is that someday China may want to join, and China is an economy heavily dominated by state-owned enterprises, and so that's why there's been so much emphasis on that part of the TPP negotiation.
We had 3 people ask this. Does TPA give the President authority over Congress to make an agreement?
Does it give him authority over Congress? Well, it would grant the U.S. Trade Representative, which is an executive branch agency, the authority to negotiate the agreement. There are, in the TPA bill that just was proposed, the whole back third, if not more, of the bill is about how the U.S. Trade Representative in the White House should consult with Congress in the negotiations. So it's a very, they're trying to outline the consultative process, but ultimately they have to vote up or down once the TPP is negotiated. It can't be amended.
Okay. Besides Japan's concerns regarding agricultural competition TPP may create, what other industries are the Japanese concerned about?
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the things that's happened in Japan over the last years is that Korea has risen up. And so industries that Japan formerly was the leader in Asia in, such as autos and consumer electronics, now you have Koreans in the form of Samsung and LG, and even autos, Hyundai and Kia, which are increasingly competitive, and so Japan doesn't want to be at a disadvantage vis-a-vis those companies because of the U.S.-Korea FTA. And so that was actually part of the motivation for Japan to seek out TPP. But I think more broadly, Japanese industry realizes that there need to be domestic internal changes in Japan, but more broadly to have such an open and high standard agreement in Asia Pacific that protects things like intellectual property really will protect their innovative industries. They've got a global scale pharmaceutical industry, increasingly in things like medical devices and other areas.
Okay, and that leads into the next one. What role will Korea play in TPP, and will it join the negotiations?
We've had a lot of interesting discussions with officials from the government of Korea recently. They are in the process of consulting with the United States and a number of other TPP economies. They've indicated that they're interested in joining. I think the answer is that it's too late for this tranche or this round, and so they're going to have to wait for TPP to be concluded, and then there would be another group of countries that could come in, and others that have talked about it include the Philippines, Korea. China's even, once Japan entered, China all of a sudden started to talk more favorably about seeking entry into TPP too. So the Japan piece here has been pretty interesting in how it's triggered a reaction in Seoul and Beijing.
Well, that's a nice lead into this next question. With TPP and other multilateral negotiations, significant potential partners wait in the wings until later stages of the negotiations. The danger is that they lose a chance to affect the agenda if they wait too long. Have the TPP negotiations reached the stage where partners need to join or else be left out?
Well, I think, as I said, for this round, yes, because they're trying to close it out. And so I think Korea couldn't come in at this time. And when they do, it actually might be easier in some ways for them because a lot of the U.S. negotiating position in TPP has been based on the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. So they're familiar with a lot of the things that were done. There are things that will be new for Korea. The state-owned enterprise chapter and some other things are going to be new for them. But I think through the discussions that they've had with USTR, they're starting to understand the parameters of TPP.
Okay. If the U.S. Congress will not grant TPA, what logic can the administration use to persuade other countries to go on making trade agreement deals?
I think ultimately a trade agreement works because of what it does. It opens markets. It brings benefits both externally and internally. And I think the inherent logic of that is something that was recognized by the TPP partners when they set out to do this agreement. Again, it's an ambitious agreement. They're doing some things that are very different than have ever been done in trade agreements. And partly it's a recognition that the 21st century trade system has changed fairly dramatically, even from, even things that were part of other negotiations a decade ago. And so I think if you want to continue to achieve or realize the gains from trade, you have to move forward with this. I think it's I don't want to call it a chicken and egg, but I think it's mutually reinforcing. I think as we make progress in TPP, Congress is going to see the inherent wisdom of moving on TPA because we've got not only TPP, but the transatlantic trade agreements under negotiation. There's a trade and services agreement that's a Washington term here, sorry, plurilateral, a bunch of countries involved in it, voluntarily signing up for this sort of thing. So all these things we need TPA for. I should have underscored that's the Chamber of Commerce's top trade priority for this year to get TPA bill through. So we'll be working very, very hard on that.
Does TPP address various U.S. government procurement barriers, such as local bidding preferences?
The government procurement chapter is complicated because everybody outside of the United States wants to talk about Buy America practices, preferences, et cetera. Some of those are federal in nature, and a lot of those are local in nature. It's very hard to get to at the local level or what's called the subnational level. It's hard to get to those kinds of issues. And so I think to the extent that they're addressed, it would be at the national level. And, that may not be the best outcome, but it's probably the most realistic outcome.
Okay. Assuming TPP does go through, what is the mechanism of resolving disputes?
Well, there is a specific dispute settlement mechanism that will be built into TPP, and so if one country found that the supposed benefits that they were to get from TPP aren't being realized for various reasons, then they could go through a formal process or procedure to achieve settlement of that. I mean, this is a common element of many trade agreements. There's dispute settlement in the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. People are reluctant to use it because it gets sensitive, heated, if you will. But it's important to have it there because countries that negotiate agreements need to honor their commitments.
You said that the U.S. is sensitive to products such as sugar, dairy, and textile. Do you think the U.S. can commit to tariffs for those products with deferred timelines?
We have suggested that that's probably the best, not necessarily the optimal way to deal with that stuff, but I think the best way to deal with the sensitive issues for the United States and for Japan is through long phase-outs of tariffs on a handful of products, not 600, but pick a few, and by a few I mean under 10, and manage it accordingly. And in some cases it may be on industrial products, and in some cases it may be on ag products, and if it's 15 years, that kind of doesn't really smell great, but it's a political, realistic way to approach something.
Okay, another farm issue in TPP. Japanese say the U.S. is asking for 100% elimination of tariffs in farm sectors aside from rice. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. I've almost run out of questions here. Do you believe that the U.S. interest in TPP would be enhanced by more publicity and greater U.S. awareness of TPP and its particular objectives?
Well, I think we have some people at the Chamber who now have become pretty conversant with the Twitterverse, if you will. And so if you look at all the stuff that's going on about TPP on Twitter, whether it's in Japan or whether it's in the United States, it's all the people that are vehemently, stridently opposed to it. And, that's where the black helicopter stuff comes through. I think that we all, and by that I mean the U.S. government, U.S. Congress, and particularly the private sector, could do a much better job of explaining to the general public the benefits of trade, in particular the benefits that could come from a sweeping trade agreement like TPP that could change the dynamics of our relationship in the Asia-Pacific.
Okay, one last question. Out of the existing free trade agreements that the U.S. is involved with, which would the TPP conditions most resemble? For example, NAFTA, U.S.-Chile FTA, U.S.-Korea FTA.
I think with that I think there are elements of all of those in TPP, but on, like the labor and environment aspects of NAFTA, they were side letters, and so they're seeking to upgrade that to a core part of the negotiating framework as opposed to a side letter. As I said before, the U.S.-Korea FTA has been kind of the benchmark or the starting point for a lot of our negotiating positions in TPP, and so I think it ultimately would resemble most closely the U.S.-Korea FTA with additions on the things like the chapter on state-owned enterprises and some of the what's called regulatory coherence and transparency, and what that essentially means is that this has often been misconstrued by the black helicopter types. We're not mandating that any country adopt U.S. regulatory practices or standards. I mean, if we have the best practices, we would like to be able to have a conversation and try to persuade them as such. What it means is that we would at least want all the TPP economies to be clear about what those practices are so that they don't become confusing and create uncertainty for businesses that are trying to deal with that stuff. Same thing for transparency. It's just trying to understand what the procedures are for making decisions in the government that affect the ability of a company to do business in a particular market.
Okay, well, thank you, James. Let's give James Fothery a big round of applause.